You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back, everybody. Your host, Michael, on a Saturday morning. Going to be bringing on Pat Flynn here once again to discuss, this time kind of in an informal jam session here, why not atheism? We're just going to talk a little bit about why we individually did not go the atheist route. And I know that's, one of the questions that a lot of people have asked about. So here we are going to be bringing him on. Pat Flynn coming up next. Pat, welcome back to the show.
Michael Lofton. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on, as always, brother.
Always good to have you on. You're the best person to talk to when it comes to this stuff because
I don't know about that, man.
In my experience, that's the case. When it comes to issues of atheism, we're going to have to get into a lot of philosophical matters. And I think you're the best at taking some extremely complicated content and communicating it in a very clear way to an audience that doesn't necessarily have, a background in philosophy. And that's why I appreciate what you do, because you do that so very well. So you're, like I said, the best person to have on this. One of the reasons why I didn't go the atheist route, and believe me, I was tempted. I can recall I was, working on my master's at Christendom. Mm-hmm. And it was around this time that I really, really became burdened. I mean, I had already been burdened with some of the problems in the Catholic Church, but I had really became burdened with it. And I just started to wonder, okay, well, is the Catholic Church truly what it claims to be? Is there really even truth at all? Mm-hmm. And a lot of other things were happening to me and that I felt was unjust. So I started asking, how can God really be good? I mean, I was really tempted to say, how is it that God is not evil if he allows this kind of injustice and this kind of evil? Now, I knew God wasn't evil, but I was just saying I was tempted to go that route. Mm-hmm. And there were several reasons why I did not go that direction, but especially my formation at Christendom and its curriculum that was rooted in Thomism helped steer me away from that. And so while I was going through that experience of questioning, my faith in the goodness of God, I was also getting a very good formation in Thomism. Right. Not to the extent that guys like you and Dr. Kerr and others have, but at least good enough to prevent me from going the atheist route. So, I really found the content of Aquinas helpful here, especially the 5 ways that he presents. But for me, the argument of contingency was extremely helpful when it comes to this, because, if there is change in the world, for example, if there are changes, if there's even potency, and we clearly observe that there has to be some kind of act that precedes it. And ultimately, you can't have that for an infinite regress. There has to be something that is act itself. And that points us to God. Only God could be act itself. So working through stuff like that helped me a lot. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of thoughts, a lot of really good thoughts. I mean, like you, I struggled and frankly, still struggle with the problem of evil. We all struggle with it, at least on a personal level, because we all have our crosses to bear. And there's times like, even if we're intellectually convinced that God exists and is good, we just cry out, well, right. Why, Lord? Right. Like, exactly. Come on, why? It's like, this is why the book of Job just becomes like increasingly more relevant the older I get. You know what I mean? Right. So like there's always struggles. There's always difficulties. I never take seriously anybody who doesn't say that they struggle or they have difficulties or they have doubts, right? We all do. So yeah, I just want to like kind of what you're getting at though is an interesting remark, because it's kind of getting toward the idea of like what is most fundamental in the world.
Mhm.
is and like just take good or evil. Like what's more fundamental, good or evil? Or are they like on a par, right? Or like they on a par? Because there's some worldviews that would say, yeah, they're on a par. They're like, there's one
Right.
good God, there's one evil God, and like that explains the problem of evil, right?
Mhm.
There's this big clash, right?
Mhm.
And the Thomistic tradition says, no, that's not right. And this was a big thing with Saint Augustine. He says, to even make sense of evil conceptually, it's always something that's privative or parasitic, right? Like we cannot make sense of evil unless there's first something good that evil attacks or draws away from. So whatever is most fundamental, it can't be purely evil, right? So the whole idea of an evil God is a conceptual impossibility, right? There's no anything that's purely evil in and of itself, right? It always has to kind of take stabs at or draw away from what is already good. So in that sense, Thomism and the metaphysics is really good because it helps to eliminate what's sometimes called the evil God challenge, right? And
Yeah.
the problem with the evil God challenge is like people think that we get to a good God by kind of like looking out into the world and like taking an inventory of things that are good versus bad, and then saying, well, it seems like there's more good things than bad, so God must be good, right? It's just a counting game, and that's obviously not how we're doing it, because we would say even if we could count more bad instances than good, which in certain periods of time maybe we can,
Right.
once you do the metaphysics, you still see that whatever is the most fundamental aspect of reality,
Yeah.
it's good is more ontologically fundamental than evil is. So I think I'm glad you brought that up because that ties into the argument from contingency, which is again about fundamentals, like what is bedrock in reality. And the argument from contingency across the great tradition that it is essentially kind of says this, right? Like if there were only things of a caused or dependent nature, then nothing would exist, right? But because something does exist, then there must be something that's categorically different, right? There must be something that exists in an uncaused or independent or self-sufficient way to make sense of why any contingent or composite or changing thing exists at all. And then we kind of run the conceptual analysis on what an uncaused thing would be. And as you said, we get to this idea of pure actuality. And from that kind of like drops out all the divine attributes and stuff like that. And but to me, it's all about like what is most fundamental, right? And they link up because from pure actuality also comes pure goodness, right? Because if we think of the good as a sort of functional concept, as it is in traditional natural law metaphysics, it's the actualization of a potential, especially a potential that perfects a being as a sort of thing that it is. Then you have this convertibility principle between goodness and being. So whatever is purely actual, which is the fullness of being as such, will also be purely good, right? So God isn't just subsistent being itself. God is subsistent goodness itself. Now, what does all this do for you? Well, and I would like to kind of hear just more about your personal journey too, Michael. But I know we just planned for this to be informal, but what it does for you is it gives you an anchor for hope, right?
Yeah.
Where in those darkest moments of your life, which we all have, where you just don't see the reason for why something terrible is happening, you can go back to reason and see that there must be a reason, even if you can't see what that reason is. And it anchors your hope in reason. And to me, that is an invaluable tool for just getting through the day to day.
Yeah. Talking about this issue of good and evil, I can say that, again, around that time that I was at Christendom, as I mentioned, there's quite a few injustices that I was experiencing and still am to this day. But at that time, it was hitting me really hard.
Right.
And
now, here's a question. Like when you were kind of like thinking about maybe leaving Catholicism or Christianity, was it for you? Was it just like Christianity or atheism, or did you think like, well, maybe I'll give up Christianity but still be like a theist, like a broad theist in some sense?
There was some temptation to maybe go to another form of Christianity, but then it wasn't adding up for me. So I started to have to ask more fundamental questions. Okay, well, if these other communions aren't adding up, maybe Christianity as a whole isn't true. I did not adopt that position. I was just tempted to entertain that, I guess I should say. But if Christianity on the whole isn't true and the other religions don't seem convincing either, now I have to ask even more fundamental questions. Is there a God at all?
Mm-hmm.
But, if it were But one of the reasons why I had to start even questioning whether or not there is a God in and of itself is because going through some of those injustices at the time, I was experiencing what I perceived to be evil.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I felt, how could God be good if we go through so much suffering and there's so much evil? But I, continued to work through the problem, and I just had to come to the conclusion that if I'm going to speak about good and evil, I have to measure that by something. I have to have a standard that I'm going to put it up against, which means that there has to be goodness in and of itself. I mean, if there's no measuring rod, I mean, how are you going to measure things, right? You have to have some kind of standard to say, well, this is less good, this is evil. There has to be some ultimate standard of goodness that you're measuring it by. So if I'm going to talk about how I'm experiencing evil and injustice, I have to be able to measure it by justice and goodness. And if there is an ultimate just being out there and a good being out there, it is God. Right. So it makes more sense to adopt the Christian paradigm that says God is good, but he allows some temporary evil for a greater good, as Romans puts it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I worked my way out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think all well, part of the reason I asked that is because I started skeptical and not religious, and then I sort of moved to a sort of broad religious pluralism, like just a broad theism, before I kind of narrowed in on Christianity. And it always just interests me when I see people who just make different moves than me. I'm just always interested in the thinking. But you bring out a good point, which is that we're confronted with reality that presents us with a lot of data. And to me, good philosophy, this is part of the reason I moved away from atheism. Good philosophy should go as far as it can to explain the data that is in front of us, right? And science too, obviously. But certain worldviews don't really explain the data. They try to explain the data away. Right. Mm-hmm. They try to say, what you think is this data point isn't really a data point at all. Right. And all that is to say that I think the Christian perspective of the data of evil is the best explanation of it. Right. And what are the things that we're trying to explain with the problem of evil? One, we're trying to explain these deep moral intuitions that we have, that there is such a thing as evil. Maybe it doesn't have like a positive ontological status where you can touch it and grip it, but it really has effects in the world, right? So even if we say that evil is privative, like blindness or a hole in the sock, right? Those privations make all the difference to people in our lives, right? So we're not like taking a position which say like, oh, there's like Christian Science, for example, which just denies that evil has any real effect in the world, that it's all illusory, right? No, evil might be a privation, but it has real effects in the world that we seriously dislike and that are seriously harmful to us, right? So we're trying to defend these strong intuitions that some things really are evil, which seems to invite the need for some way that things really ought to be, some type of standard, right? And I think we can explain this in different ways. We can explain it in an approximate way and an ultimate way. Approximate way is by affirming that there are such things as natures or essences, and that there's ways those natures or essences can be perfected, I should say, or defective, right? So, it is a perfection of me as a rational animal, given that's my nature, to increase in knowledge and to try and avoid ignorance where possible and stuff like that, right? So we can make sense of evil sort of approximately when something is missing that otherwise should be there, that is due to the thing in question, right? So it's not evil for a rock to be ignorant, because a rock doesn't have a rational nature, right? It's a negation, it's missing, but it's not a privation, it's not evil. It would be evil for me, broadly speaking, to be blind, because having sight is due to me as part of my having eyes, for example. Now, we're using evil in a really, really broad sense, because sometimes people like to think of evil just as sort of moral evil, like lying to people or stabbing people. But in the Thomistic tradition, evil just covers all privations, right? And moral evil is a certain type of privation. It's a privation where there should be a consideration of a moral rule that attaches to a particular judgment, right? So I know we talked about this on our last conversation with Gavin, so I won't repeat too much of it. But if I judge that, I want and need money, and that's fine, that's not a bad thing in and of itself, and then I make the judgment to hit some innocent guy over the head with a crowbar to get money, well, there's a privation there, in as much as I forgot to consider the moral rule that you shouldn't hit innocent people over the head with a crowbar to get money, right? It's what's missing from that that's the problem. Oops, sorry, my bad. And it's a big problem because I knew that, right? I habitually knew that, but I chose not to consider it, right? I engaged in what might be called a sort of voluntary ignorance, right? I didn't put the rule under consideration when it ought to have been considered. And that's where privation comes in, when a do good is missing. Now, all this to say is that I think Christianity makes the best sense of the problem of evil because it allows us to maintain and make sense of the data rather than explaining it away. We have an ultimate moral standard on Christianity, which is God. We have proximate standards, which are natures, which are just finite participations in existence, God being subsistent existence and subsistent goodness itself. We have the resources we need to explain consciousness and rationality, which are also kind of bound up with the moral picture. And we can rightfully say that things have gone wrong, right? Like that things really aren't as they should be in this particular situation. And then it's just a matter of asking, well, why would God allow this? And that's where kind of like theodicies come in and stuff like that. I don't see another worldview that can explain evil as well as Christianity can. Other worldviews have to explain away some aspects of the problem of evil, or they have to explain away pretty much all aspects of the problem of evil. But none really give an adequate explanation in the sense that Christianity does. If that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah. And what would you say about what, the comments that I made earlier about if we're going to talk about moral evil and a deprivation of a do good, doesn't that mean there has to be an ultimate standard of goodness that we're measuring this by? Otherwise, isn't evil at that point just relative?
Yeah, I think, I kind of go about this in I guess a slightly different way than the traditional, I guess, moral argument for God, right? Because I think that's why I kind of differentiated between the proximate standard and the ultimate standard. So the proximate standard for at least evils concerning human beings would be human nature, right? Mm-hmm. And so we can kind of like figure out a lot of morality by just contemplating on human nature, sure, what perfects it, the types of virtues, what frustrates it, what is a good instance of a human, what is a bad instance of a human, right? So in that sense,
which Aristotle does, to my recollection, correct?
Yeah, I mean, people can just start with Nicomachean Ethics. Now we could argue about whether he got all of it right? But that's essentially his project, right? And I think we would probably want to argue, no, Aristotle got certain things wrong about human nature and what is perfective, but he seemed to also get a lot of other things right, and certainly his general project seems to be in the right direction, right? Mm-hmm. However, we then need to make sense of why there is a such thing of human nature in the first place, and what gives it its intelligible structure, its configuration of being, if you will, and what orders it to its end. That's where you need God, right? So you need God to kind of like back the whole system up, right? And to make sense of goodness as such fully, in order to make sense of human nature and categorical imperatives and stuff like that. So I'm actually trying to like grant a fair amount to people who might not be Christians or theists and say we can do a fair amount of moral reasoning on the kind of proximate level by granting an essentialism. That's what I'm saying, right? But once we have an essentialism, then that the world really does have natures, and that there are certain ways natures can be perfected, right? That they have a teleology, an end. That, to make sense of that, is when you need the ultimate standard, right? The ultimate governor, the ultimate creator, which is God. Yeah. So I think theism has to support or underlie the entire system, but we don't have to think about or punt to God right away when it comes to questions of moral reasoning all the time, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, in other words, even from the paradigm just considered, just considering maybe human nature, let's just pretend for the moment that there is no God. I know this ultimately doesn't pan out, but let's just pretend for the moment there is no God. You would still say that an atheist is still able to make some moral claims, just just based on natural law and human nature. Is that effectively what you're saying?
Yeah, they could try and be maybe an Aristotelian naturalist, right?
Yeah,
and there are a few of those out there. They're kind of rare. And I think they're kind of rare because I think as soon as you are thinking in an Aristotelian paradigm, it really it's so naturally lends itself to theism.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
But yeah, I would say to a certain degree that project could be engaged in, but to undergird it, to support it, and to ultimately make sense of it, you will need theism at the end of it. Right.
Because if we're talking about human nature, now we're talking about a form and essence and things like that, and it's going to bring us back to God ultimately.
And certainly, I think also for moral obligations as well and stuff like this, right? So, or like even if somebody wants to take like a sort of atheistic Platonism or something like that, which has always seemed very strange to me, but that's another thing you find out there, right? And that there's the realm of the forms. There's no God, but there's a realm of the forms, and then there's kind of us, and we kind of are participating in the forms somehow. I just have a lot of difficulty trying to make sense of that. There seems to be a causal interaction problem, right? But then there also seems to be an obligation issue. Like why am I obligated, right? To some entirely abstract entity, right? So when it comes to the moral life, I think we also do need to seriously consider obligations as well. And there's different ways that theists and Catholics think about this, but I don't think it's completely illegitimate to say that in order to make sense of obligations, there does need to be some type of concrete authority. And how you cash that out philosophically will vary across the tradition. But obligation is an important aspect of our moral life. Again, it's a data point that needs to be explained. I think theism explains obligation better than any other rival theory out there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I'm curious when it comes to this topic, what was probably the biggest thing for you that said, you know what, I can't continue in my atheist trajectory. I need to at least be a theist.
Right. Yeah. So just to kind of give the highlights of my story. So I was baptized, and I had a very nominal upbringing. I received like your basic kindergarten catechesis type of thing, right? Like very crude, very simplistic, first grade theology, never any further than that. Come middle school, we start learning about the origins of the universe, the general sketches of Big Bang Theory. And I remember like at the time, like perceiving a startling conflict, right? Just like, this doesn't sound like what I was taught in first grade Sunday school, right? Like, where's the snake and the devil and Adam and Eve and all this or that, right? So it's not like I just threw my hands up in the sixth grade, like I'm an atheist, right? It was just one of those first seeds of doubt and difficulties that would send me on a certain trajectory. So later on, I get introduced into philosophy proper through certain writers I was really interested in, writers like Mark Twain and H.L. Mencken, who kind of passed me off to Friedrich Nietzsche and stuff like that, some of these atheists and existentialists. So that's when I started really getting interested in philosophy. So I didn't get interested in philosophy because of people like St. Thomas or Christian philosophers. It was this other camp. And this camp mostly had only very negative things to say about Christianity, right? So that influenced my worldview as a whole for a long time. But what really eventually popped me out of atheism, Michael, wasn't encountering the argument from contingency or something like that. Mm-hmm. It was going deeper into atheism and naturalism and realizing how explanatorily inadequate it ultimately was. And so I'll just give you an example, right? So if you're kind of like a naturalist, but also a physicalist, and I think atheism is interesting to the extent that it is reductionist, that it tries to give a very simple and ontologically lean explanation, which is why I have a more difficult time taking seriously atheism that tries to be Aristotelian or Platonic, because it's like you just brought in all this stuff that was originally kind of rejected to motivate atheism in the first place. So it's like it just seems like theism light to me, right? But if you look at it from a reductionist standpoint, then I think what you realize is that And it isn't just you that will realize this, because if you're following certain atheistic thinkers, right, everybody from Friedrich Nietzsche to contemporaries like Alex Rosenberg, you realize that from a particular starting point, a naturalistic, physicalist starting point, if you drive through consistently on that, you're going to be led to pretty absurd results. You're going to be led to explaining away aspects of experience rather than explaining aspects of experience. Now, what would that be? It would be things, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things, but it could be everything from consciousness, right? You have atheists that say that consciousness is just an illusion, right? Because they can't make sense of it on physicalism. Morality, which we've been talking about, right? That morality is something that's just sort of fobbed off through the socio-evolutionary process, right? There's no binding moral structure in the world. We don't discover morality, we invent it, right? And that doesn't seem, intuitively, that seems very wrong, right? Like, certainly, like, we think that preferences and opinions have their place, but like morality in its most fundamental aspect isn't just a matter of preference, right? At least that's our general intuition of it, right? So atheism would seem in many cases to explain that away. I say in many cases because there are atheists who don't think that's the case, but this is just the path that I took, right? Consciousness, morality, contingency, the big daddy question of why is there something rather than nothing? Why do all of these cause realities exist at all? I don't think atheism can ultimately provide a satisfactory explanation to that. So ultimately, it depends whether you think reality is intelligible, fundamentally, fully intelligible, or whether you think reality is absurd. So for me, it was seeing that the atheistic project, specifically from a reductionist, physicalist, naturalist standpoint, kept reducing itself to absurdity. And you have other thinkers that would go so far as to deny meaning and truth and whatever, that I came to this point where I'm like, I don't know what's true, but it can't be this, right? Like, cannot be this, right? And that's when I finally decided to read other stuff and consider thinkers that I had like passing familiarity with, you know, just from like intro to philosophy classes, like Plato and Aristotle, but never like really studied in any major depth. And it was by like wanting to broaden my horizons, so to speak, and stop being such a sort of chronological snob that just because something's older, it must be wrong or something like that, right? That eventually I did work my way to the great Thomistic tradition, not just Thomas himself, but all the great Thomists, right? Thinkers, especially like Jacques Maritain and Norris Clarke and Bernard Lonergan, who just had a profound impact on me. And then that's when I got really interested in arguments for God and began to see that theism could make sense of all these aspects of reality that atheism couldn't in a really satisfactory way. That eventually I just came to say, yeah, this is just a much better hypothesis, right? I'm going with this one, right? So now I forget your original question because
that answered it. And you know, I want to get your comments here. Scripture talks about in Romans 1, and you know the Psalms talk about it as well, that nature testifies to God's existence. And before I ever even read the Bible and knew about these things, I can recall as just teenager, you know, even younger than that, looking outside the window, looking at nature and just thinking to myself, this could not have just happened by random chance.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't know a whole lot beyond, you know, a whole lot more than that. I wasn't able to articulate it any further than that, but I knew intuitively this had to have come from something, from someone, a creator. I just couldn't believe that this would come by random chance or an accident. And again, like I said, Scripture testifies to that. What do you think of that argument, however?
Yeah, I think it's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, we all, and especially if you take certain aspects of psychology seriously, I mean, we all kind of come into the world with a sort of teleological mindset, right? Like we do tend to see purpose in order in the world. And the reason for that is because I think there is purpose in order in the world, right?
Right.
So like, that's not surprising. That's definitely not something that we project. And, you know, in my experience, and I think with others, you know, atheism is really an aberration, right? It's never been a majority position. And even now it's still a minority position. Like people who are like full-blooded atheists, right, are statistically very slim. It might be more now than it was in other periods, but it's still it's not an easy position to get into, right? Like you really have to read a lot of, I would argue, sophistry to which I did, right? And, you know, it might not be intended as sophistry. I think to like confuse yourself enough to start to deny what otherwise seems so basic and obvious, that things just didn't pop into being from nothingness, that what seems to be harmony, structure, and order didn't emerge just from formless random chaos, right? Like at the end of the day, all the sophisticated technical arguments for God, which, you know, I've spent a lot of time on and working through some of the more clever objections, like they're really just affirming these basic, obvious, common sense intuitions, right? That that reality is intelligible, that there's an ordering mind behind this, however we want to cash that out, that things don't pop into being from nothing. The good and evil are, you know, that we can affirm that there are objective moral values and duties and stuff like that. So I guess as I've aged, Michael, I've just gained a lot more sympathy with that. And it's certainly something I believed for a long time. It wasn't until I just read a bunch of atheistic literature that I think I became confused enough to start denying what is otherwise very hard to deny. And I'll make one more point. Because I've had people say this to me before, and I think that they mean it as derogatory, but they might have a good point. I'll talk about my conversion. They'll say, "Oh, well, you were just never truly an atheist." And maybe that's right? You know, Jay Budichevsky, if I'm pronouncing that right, he's got a book that's called "What You Can't Not Know," right? And it's kind of about morality, but I think it's about reality as a whole, right? It's like, I think deep down, I probably always knew that God was real and existed. I just tricked myself for long enough, in some very confused way, right? So maybe I wasn't. Maybe I like really wasn't an atheist, whatever that means. But that doesn't like faze me or bother me, because chances are I probably read a lot more atheists than that person and know a lot more about the worldview in general than they do. So if it's meant as an insult, it doesn't mean anything to me. But it might actually be true. Maybe I never really was. I don't know. That's a hard question for me to answer. Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's been any moments where, as a Christian, you look through Thomist arguments, or just more broadly Christian arguments, for the theistic case, and you think, wow, hold on, wait, this is a really bad argument, and this makes me reconsider theism, and I wonder if atheism is true. You know, does that ever happen, or no, not really?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of bad arguments for God, or at least we could say they're badly presented, right?
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, let's just take a classic example, right? A lot of people would be like, of course God exists because everything must have a cause, right? Now, that's a bad argument, because if everything has a cause, it immediately opens you up to the objection, well, what caused God, right? And then we have this sort of vicious regress. The contingency argument, the proper argument for God, actually says not everything can have a cause, right? It starts from that like reality as a whole, whatever that is, whether it's a single big thing or just a collection of many different things, right? There's nothing outside of reality as a whole that could act as cause. So by definition, right? So not everything can have a cause. We could be certain of that. But then it seems like most things have a cause. So what's the solution? The solution is there must be some foundation that doesn't have a cause. And then you ask, well, how can something not have a cause? And then you have to realize that it must be categorically different than the things that do have causes, right? Like it must not have limits. It must not have restrictions. It must not have boundaries. It must not be composite. And that's where you get to the self-sufficiency that is subsistent existence itself, which is God, right? Now, the bad argument, right? It's only bad because they're just not trained philosophers, but it's intuitively a good argument, right? Mm-hmm. Because I like, to be charitable, what they're probably saying is like, most of the things that I see require an explanation for their existence. So like, that leads me to affirm that there must be like some ultimate creator. That's what they're trying to say, right? Yeah. But they're just confused in how they say it. So, you know, and if you press them, they probably couldn't be able to articulate it, and a trained skeptic could probably confuse them and probably convince them that it's a bad argument. But I would actually want to say, no, your intuitions are right there. We just need to refine it, right? Yeah. So that's I don't know if that is relevant to
but do do any of these bad arguments make you question your paradigm all on the whole altogether, or not really?
Yeah, well, I guess if it's an argument for God, that's a good question, because at most it would just lead me to think that either this argument doesn't prove God's existence, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. It just means this isn't a successful pathway, right? So even if you don't have a good argument for God, that is not a positive argument for atheism, right? It could be the case that you have no successful logical pathways to God, but that God still exists, right? Yeah. So what would now? I don't think that's the case. I do think you have successful pathways, and I think there's other like things that are suggestive. Like they're not like the metaphysical demonstrations that Aquinas was after, but you know, like I think you get other arguments that are probabilistic that help, and I think those come in degrees. And then I think you just have some things that I just don't think are successful or have that much force. And to that extent, I would just say, this just doesn't weigh strongly in favor of theism, but that by itself doesn't weigh in favor of atheism. It just means we don't have a successful. We just don't have a weight in the scale either way, right?
Yeah. Somebody's asking on here, have you read Blackwell's Companion to Natural Theology? And if so, what are your thoughts? Any comments there?
That's right over there. It's a great companion on natural theology. You have contributions in there from Proust and Bill Craig. If anybody's interested in metaphysics, I think it's a must read. I mean, Proust goes about the contingency argument a little bit different than I do. Alex Proust, a Catholic philosopher, but his exposition in there is top notch. It's world class, and you have arguments from reason in there. You have Tim and Lydia McGrew's contribution, an argument, a probabilistic argument for the resurrection, which I think is very, very powerful, very thoughtful. I'm a big fan. I think it's a great volume. It's thick. It's definitely for the advanced philosopher, but if you're serious about this stuff, I would definitely pick it up. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned William Lane Craig there. What are your thoughts on him? Is his material really helpful, or do you not find it so?
No, I admire Dr. Craig for so much of what he does, and I think he's an extremely intelligent man. But obviously, I part ways with him, right? Because I'm a Thomist classical theist, and he's not. He's critical of it now,
right?
So I mean, he's got a view of God and time and eternity that I don't think is correct. And you know, there's metaphysical reasons for that. I guess we would have to just kind of focus on a particular aspect of his work. So take the Kalam argument, for example. Mm-hmm. That would be one where I think it's as the way Craig presents it. There's different formulations, right? I'd say it's probably a good argument, right? However, I'd want to make a number of qualifications of how it's presented. I would be much more, I would say, attracted to the way that Robert Koons or Alex Proust developed the Kalam cosmological arguments, and for reasons where there's other metaphysical implications that matter on how you present this type of argument. So, what Proust will do, he's got a book called Infinity, Causation, and Paradox, and he wants to argue that for a position that is called a sort of restricted anti-infinitism. So he wants to say that no effect can be preceded by an infinite number of causes, right? But he leaves it open that a cause could produce an infinite number of effects. And I think that's right. I'm not sure that Craig wants to leave that latter option open with his arguments against actual infinities. And so in that, we're kind of getting deep into the weeds of something here, but that would be an instance where I would part from Craig and go more in the direction of Alex Proust or somebody like that. But what Proust does, I think, still gives you enough to run a Kalam argument. It would just be done in a way different than Bill Craig. So all of which is say I have much respect for Bill Craig. I think he does great work, but we certainly have our differences. Yeah.
I think that he just had a debate with Jimmy Akin on this. Is that right? Did you see that?
I did not yet. I literally just geared it up before we hopped on here, but I haven't had a chance. I would have a chance to do it. I see somebody said, Brando says, Craig would say that the future is a potential infinite. And this is interesting, right? So since because there's an objection to the kalam, right, or a sort of ad hominem objection, but it's a principled ad hominem objection where some people will say, well, if you don't allow for actual infinities, right, but you say God gives us like eternal life, might we have a problem there where we have a sort of an actual infinite, right? Now, Craig can dodge that move because he puts God in time and say that's not an actual infinite, it's a potential infinite, right? Making distinctions, Aristotelian distinction between actual and potential. But if you're a classical theist, or as most theists are, and think that God is timeless and eternal, you might have an issue there, right? That might be a principled difficulty where what you're arguing for might come back to bite you in a certain respect. And I think Jimmy is aware of this. At least what I've read from him, Jimmy is aware of this. And this is something I was aware of myself. And that's one of the reasons why I would prefer Pruse's position for this, because then you have an asymmetry, right, where you can you don't run into that sort of difficulty. And I think it's not ad hoc, right, because as Pruse will show in his book, it seems like the paradoxes that might give you a contradiction in terms of any one effect having an infinite number of causes, you don't seem to get the same sort of problems if you consider one cause that has an infinite number of effects. So it really seems like there is a real asymmetry here. And once you have that on the table, I think that that difficulty dissolves, and the classical theist is clear and free, free and clear. Excuse me. I don't know if Jimmy brought that up in their exchange because I haven't watched it yet, but that is something that I think that Jimmy is at least aware of, and that would be something I agree with Jimmy on. Right.
Not to go too far down a rabbit trail, but since we're talking about this, I'm just curious to get your thoughts here. There was a discussion that Dr. Craig had with Bishop Barron on simplicity. And of course, this relates into the issue of atheism. They have a difference in views there. It seems like he rejects the traditional understanding of the simplicity of God, if I'm representing him correctly.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think about that? And did you see that discussion?
Yeah, I saw that discussion, but it was a long time ago, so I don't have the details fresh in my mind. So I don't want to misrepresent everybody. But I keep up with Craig's work, and I listen to his podcast when I can. And I remember that in one of his recent podcasts where he was critiquing Thomism, he said something that like really astonished me. He said that Aquinas gives no arguments for the real distinction between essence and existence. He did not say that Aquinas gave arguments he found unconvincing. He said Aquinas gives no arguments whatsoever. Now, you hate to use the cliche, but that sounds like somebody who really doesn't understand Thomism. I mean, that's Aquinas' De Ente, right? That's the whole project. That's
the first book that he wrote, isn't it?
Right. Well, it's one of his earlier works, to be sure.
Yeah. And I thought it was his first, but yeah, it was really early. He wrote it as a young man.
Yeah, like 29 or 30 or something like that, right? And certainly held with that position throughout the rest of his life and his right. And he gives multiple reasons to think that there is the real distinction between essence and existence, right? And what that does is it sets you up a sort of a metaphysical causal regress of composite things, right? If something has a real distinction between essence and existence, we're only going to be able to explain that once we get back to something that is pure existence as such, right? And it's going to have to be pure. It's going to have to be a pure act of existence existing through itself. And the reason it would have to be pure is it's not going to be susceptible to differentiating features, right? So anything that would be different from the act of existence existing through itself either would have to be not actual, which means it would have to be caused, or would have to be not existing through itself, but through something else, which means it would have to be caused. So that won't work because this fundamental reality would have to be uncaused. But then if you try to get differentiating features in it, those would always be caused. So then you would have an uncaused cause reality, which is a contradiction, right? Now, what that gives you is it gives you pure subsistent being itself, a purely actual being. And simplicity is part of that deal, that package deal, because composite things always stand in need of an extrinsic explanation. And Aquinas argues from the metaphysical compositeness of essence and existence, right? It struck me, and again, I know Craig's writing a much larger volume on systematic theology, so this was just off of a podcast, and you always want to be charitable because I'm sure I've said dumb things right now too because it's just informal, right? So, It just strikes me that Craig hasn't spent enough time really with the Thomistic literature on this issue, and that it is a significant metaphysical cost, and I think cost in terms of explanation, to make God in any way composite. I think whatever other difficulties you're trying to resolve by bringing composition into God and divine simplicity are always going to be orders of magnitude way greater, right, than just holding to the doctrine of divine simplicity and dealing with, any of the other difficulties you think that come with that, which is, of course, it was just something I've spent a lot of time on myself, right? It's a difficult doctrine to wrap your head around, and not just simplicity, but it's other commitments that come with it, like immutability, for example. But I think those difficulties can all be dealt with. And I have if anybody's interested, I have a very long podcast on my YouTube channel. If you just Google Pat Flynn defending divine simplicity, it's like an hour and a half. I go through modal collapse objections, changing knowledge objections. These are things that Dr. Craig brings up. So if you're interested how to deal with those, just check out that podcast, because I actually advance multiple models just to show like there are good ways of dealing with this. And it seems like a lot of critics aren't even aware that these models are out there most of the time. So
yeah, and somebody's in the chat saying, they have a problem with simplicity because it seems to say God can't have emotions that change. I mean, what do you say about this, about somebody who says, look, God doesn't have emotions if he's simple, so he can't really relate to us human beings?
Yeah, I mean, this is a complicated thing, because we have to talk about what we mean by emotions. We mean God has passions, or that God can be affected by something beyond himself. Or are we talking about things like joy and love? Because obviously God has joy. Obviously God has love. But I actually don't think that we want to I don't think let me just start on the cartoon version. I don't want to think like God is emotionally volatile, right? Like that doesn't I just want people to caution people, what are you asking for? Right. Yeah. Because it seems to me people worry about immutability because they think that you can't have a real relation with God. And by real relation, they think a real relationship with God. Now, Aquinas famously denies that God has any real relation to creatures, but he's not talking about having a relationship. He's talking about what's on the ontological scene and what direction dependency flows. Ultimately, what Aquinas means by God having no real relation to creation is that all of creation is dependent upon God. God is in no way dependent upon creation. That's absolutely right, right? Metaphysics gives you that. It doesn't mean that God can't bring us into a relationship with himself.
It doesn't mean that he doesn't have a covenant with us, as Scripture testifies.
Right. And now all that covenant comes first through the primary action of God. And then once you realize that God is impassible and stuff like that, yeah, in the general sense of passions, we are going to deny certain passions of God, right? But I don't think that's a bad thing, because what we wind up with at the end of the day is a God that is unconditionally loving, right? And that is the most secure and beautiful thing that I think we could ever want and hope for, like a God that will love us no matter what we do. Like we can't trigger God into not loving us anymore. Like he just becomes so enraged and volatile. Like that would be a nightmare if that were the case, right? Because I'd always be wondering, have I so triggered God at this point that maybe I can't possibly be saved. And then once you kind of deal with the allegorical and metaphysical language in Scripture of God's wrath and stuff like that, I think these issues dissolve, and that classical theism gives you a God of unconditional, absolutely secure and reliable love. And I don't think there's anything better than that. So my general response to that is just think more deeply about what you're asking for when you want to put emotions in God. And that at the end of the day, I think what we want is a God that is unconditionally loving. And I think that's exactly what classical theism gives you, right?
This one is from Jonathan. How much have you looked into the logical problem of the Trinity, and what is your preferred way of addressing it? Yeah. Does it give atheists justification for denying God's existence?
Well, certainly not, right? If anything, it would say you maybe shouldn't be a Christian, right? Mm-hmm. So this is one of those things where I think people should be careful and make the right distinctions. Like just because even if you were convinced that there was a true logical issue with the Trinity, then that doesn't mean you shouldn't become an atheist. And you could become a Muslim, or you could just be like a broad Neoplatonist or something like that, right? You could still be a theist, just not a Christian. My preferred way of addressing it is just classic Mysterianism, right? I think if you want to go deeper, this is not an area of specialization for me. It was one of those things that I had to work out for myself, as I was going on the way, but it's not something I read or research or write heavily about. But Bernard Lonergan, I think, is a tremendous resource here. Check him out and his work and his writing. And then, I think that there's just a principled Mysterianism we can take, both with respect to classical theism and the Trinity. So that's just kind of the direction I would point people.
I'm sure there's going to be some atheists who watch this and would say, okay, well, what would you point me to if I'm interested in the theist position? Is there a good introductory book to point me to?
So if you're, somebody brought up it depends. Yeah. What you mean by introductory? Like if you're like already, pretty well-versed in philosophy and you like as much rigor as possible. Somebody brought up the Blackwell Companion of Natural Theology. Certainly, I think that's not introductory for most people, right? That's definitely not. I would actually recommend a metaphysical book, textbook. It's introductory, but it's called The One and the Many by Father Norris Clark. And in fact, I have it right here because I was just citing it for something I was doing. So here it is. Yeah. And this is a tremendous book, and it's actually sort of an overview of Thomistic metaphysics. But towards the end, he does give a contemporary contingency argument, right, in the spirit of St. Thomas Aquinas. It's not any one of Aquinas's 5 ways. But the reason I would recommend this book is it's not just about arguing that God exists. It's about carving reality at its joints and trying to discover the highest truths and deepest causes, if you will. And to me, that's what theism is all about, right? It's about making or really affirming the intelligibility of reality, which is why in traditional metaphysics, you don't start with God, right? You start with what's in front of you. You start making the distinctions you need to make sense of reality, distinctions between act, potency, form, matter, substance, accidents, essence, existence. And then what kind of comes out of that at the end as the ultimate condition for all of that stuff to make all of that ultimately intelligible, of course, is pure actuality, which is God. So God's sort of the capstone of the metaphysical project. We don't start with God. We start with what's in front of us, and then that ineluctably leads us to God. So I would say The One and the Many by Norris Clark, another just sort of good one from a Thomistic standpoint. If you do just want arguments for the existence of God, I've always thought that Ed Fazer's book, 5 Proofs, was very well done. And he gives 5 different arguments in there, all kind of in a Thomistic flavor. He gives an Aristotelian argument, a Neoplatonic argument, an Augustinian argument, which I think is always very interesting, an argument from the principle of sufficient reason, and the classic Thomistic argument. So those would be maybe 2 works I would start people with. I'd be curious your recommendations, Michael.
They would not compare to yours, I'll tell you that. I mean, like I said, my training in philosophy was to prepare me for theology. My main expertise is in systematic theology, and now focusing especially on the magisterium. But in order to do theology, you have to do some prep work in philosophy, because theology builds on nature, right? Revelation builds on nature. Theology builds on top of philosophy. So I had to do some basics when it comes to Thomism and philosophy, but not to the extent that you guys do, which is why I enjoy having y'all on the show so much.
Well, I appreciate it. I really do. It's always a joy to be here.
I have that book, The One and the Many, that you just mentioned there. I was thinking about it the other day. I have not read it yet, but that's definitely encouraged me to go ahead and do so, because I've heard quite a few people recommend it.
Yeah, I would also I would recommend anything by Norris Clark. I would also recommend his book, Explorations in Metaphysics, which is really just a collection of his essays and papers throughout the years. And I think what you'll find is that, as usual, sort of, all the old stuff is new again. So he's got a great essay in there called A New Look at the Immutability of God. I talk a little bit about it in that podcast where I'm defending divine simplicity. And he's sort of arguing against various theologians at the time that had issues with the traditional doctrine of divine simplicity that are pressing very similar objections to the same ones that are being pressed today. So I think Clark gives very good responses in that essay.
What do you think as far as an intro book, Brian Davies, an introduction to the philosophy of religion, I believe is what it is?
Yeah, Brian Davis.
What do you think of that one? Yeah, Brian Davis.
That would certainly you can't go wrong with him. He's got two other books I would recommend to people, both related to this conversation. One is How to Think About God, or is that what it's called? I forget the title of it. It's his book with God in the title. That isn't or it might be Thinking About God. Something like that, right? That one's very good. But one he's probably even better known for at this point would be The Reality of God and the Problem of Evil. Okay. And that's where he's giving a very, very, some people think it's a little too harsh, Thomistic defense of against the problem of evil. I think it's a tremendous book though. And I think anybody who's seriously interested both in and he does in that book give some Thomistic arguments for God's existence first. So he does spend some time showing here's why we should believe that God exists before he starts trying to diffuse the problem of evil. So I would definitely recommend Brian Davis. Absolutely.
Last one. I think it was a History of Philosophy book by Geisler. Now I know he's Protestant, but he kind of leans into Thomistic.
He's a Thomist, right?
Do you think that was good? Is his content helpful?
I have not read that one, so I can't speak of that. But no, I know I've read Geisler, and he is somebody who is, though he's not Catholic, he was pretty staunch defender of Thomism and classical theism. So yeah, and he is accessible. He writes kind of a lot of popular level stuff too. So
right, yeah, that's why I thought of him, just because I mean, at least his History of Philosophy book is written in a way that you can really you don't have to have any kind of background in philosophy. You just open it up and it's pretty helpful. So.
Right. You know what? Can I recommend one more? If you're interested in history of philosophy, well. Yeah, I'll recommend one more. Mortimer Adler's book, 10 Philosophical Mistakes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
It's fantastic, right? And it's fantastic because Adler is somebody who himself brilliant dude, started as an agnostic, eventually became Christian. And then I think in his 90s, I think it was 3 years before he died, he became Catholic. And he's somebody who was very much influenced by Thomism. So 10 Philosophical Mistakes is essentially showing how many of the sort of how much of the modern philosophical paradigm, how it got started, identifying what the mistake was, and essentially showing how going back to St. Thomas fixes it. So he doesn't give really an argument for God in that book, but I think if you want a history of sort of philosophical ideas and where things kind of went off the rails and what the corrective is, I think that's an awesome book.
I loved that book. We had to read it at Christendom. I remember the 10th one, the 10th reason or objection or whatever he was dealing with there, and he was addressing what makes humans different than animals. And I'd never really seen anybody really write on it, but his answers in there were extremely helpful. So that one always really stuck with me because he touched on an area that I had not heard really anybody else talk a whole lot about. I mean, we obviously know that we're different than other animals, but okay, how? And he talks about language and things like that, and religion, and he gives different examples, but language was the big one for me.
Right. Yeah. The big distinction he makes there, and this is very Thomistic, right, is the difference between perceptual and conceptual ideas, right? And I actually have an article where I make that argument, or a similar one, with Catholic Answers. So if people want to kind of see that thought drawn out, just the article's called "Are You More Advanced Than a Crab?" Because Catholic Answers asked me to respond to some biologist on Twitter who was making fun of people who think that humans are the most advanced species because a crab could build a cool thing, right? So in that article, I argue in a very similar way with Adler there that we really do have what's called metaphysical superiority, right? That we're not just different in degree, we're different in kind. We have this whole category or suite of powers that the lower animals, the lower beasts certainly do not, right? So that's an awesome aspect of the book. He also has a good chapter in there on free will. He's got consciousness and its objects. He's got he offers some corrections on epistemology and knowledge. I'm trying to remember what else.
Is it him who talks about how one of the differences between us and animals is intellection and our ability to, extract forms from something, right, and to then think of forms. And I think it was him who was noting that, animals can't do that. So there's a fundamental difference there. And this is something that is part of the soul, and it is immaterial. And then that's then approved for the eternality of the soul. Since it's immaterial, it's indestructible. And I think that was him who was talking about it.
Yeah. So our ability to form concepts, right, to be able to identify and to discriminate between different kinds of things, and then to compose and divide, as the scholastics would say, to say which concepts do and do not belong together, and then to make judgments, as we compose and divide, and then of course to reach, and then to use inference, right, to reach further conclusions from previous judgments. All this is like that, these suite of powers, right, that the lower animals do not have, right? And this is, it would also be argued, as Aquinas does, that this is ultimately an immaterial power for various reasons. One is that it involves our grasping of universals, right, and that any particular physical finite thing is not universal. Right. So including like, chemical interactions in the brain and stuff like that. So Adler has a great line at the end of that chapter where he says something like, even though we cannot think without our brains, we do not think with our brains. Right. Yeah. Is kind of how he includes that. Right. And that's I think that's absolutely right. Tremendous book. I'm glad that one got brought up. And if people want to go even deeper after that, his book, 6 Great Ideas, goes even more in depth on a number of the things that he details in 10 Philosophical Mistakes. He's kind of a hidden, he's well known, sort of, but I just can't speak highly enough of Adler. He was very influential.
Wasn't he behind the 66 volume set that I have here, the Great Books of the Western World?
Guy, right?
Wasn't he behind that?
Yeah, he's one of the big Great Books guys. He's also got a really famous book, which was the first one I read from Adler before I read any of his other stuff, which came much later, called How to Read a Book.
Yeah.
And that book's phenomenal, right? Like, it'll just teach you how to really struggle with a book that is currently above your level of understanding, how to kind of like reach up and like pull yourself up to a higher level of understanding just when it's just you and a text, right? And so it's like the skill of acquiring more understanding and knowledge with a book, which is certainly a lost skill.
Yeah. Excellent. Good recommendations. I enjoyed this chat, Pat. You are welcome on anytime. I always enjoy it.
Likewise, my brother. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thanks to the audience for the great conversation as well.
And put in a plug for your content.
Yes. I am the host of the Pat Flynn Show, the humbly and originally named Pat Flynn Show. It's on iTunes. You can find some of the content on YouTube as well. So if you just Google Pat Flynn, and there's a couple Pat Flynns out there, so make sure it's a relevant searching so you get the right Pat Flynn. There's some fake Pat Flynns out there on the internet. My website is chroniclesofstrength.com as well, so you can always find me there. So appreciate it, Michael.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on. You're always welcome on. And everybody, thank y'all for watching. Of course, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Share this on your social media. Also, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. I'm about to add some extra content there for patrons only today. So go and check it out and become a patron. Till next time, God bless you all.